Good day. Today is Monday, 5th January 2026, and before I proceed with this video, let me just remind you again, once you've watched the video and you've decided that you like what you've seen, then please remember to tick the like button and check your subscription to this channel. Well, the last 24 hours we still have echoes from the events in Venezuela, the capture, abduction, kidnap by the United States of President Maduro and his arrival in the United States. I've discussed all of the events relating to this in great detail in the latest programs that I've done for this channel, and we've done further programs about this affair on the Duran. I'm simply going to make a few further quick observations before I move on to other matters. And the first is that the speculations that the United States and powerful elements within the Venezuelan government were in collusion with each other, and that the ouster and abduction of President Maduro was as much an internal coup as it was a military operation carried out by the United States. Well, it seems to me that that gets further and further support every day. We now learn that that the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, had become increasingly unimpressed, both with Maria Machado and other members of the Venezuelan opposition. He was developing deep skepticism that they would have any ability, if they were put in place, to take control of the country and to run the country effectively. And apparently the United States, or at least Secretary Rubio, who seems to be the major driver of events in Venezuela, concluded that the best way forward was to agree with elements within the Venezuelan government on the ouster of President Maduro and his abduction and taking to the United States, but on the retention in power of the current government. And there are reports that American officials had regular meetings, this time it seems in Qatar, between themselves and representatives of the Venezuelan authorities. And these negotiations proceeded, and it appears that the United States, or at least Secretary Rubio and other US officials, developed a certain respect for Delcy Rodriguez, who is, of course, now the interim president of Venezuela, and took the view that she was certainly somebody that they could work with. And, well, I'm going to say it straightforwardly, it seems to me that the deal was done. Apparently around 40 people were killed over the course of the American military operation, more than was originally alleged, but it seems that a number of people were killed, but 32 of them appear to have been Cubans, and as far as I can tell, they seem to have been drawn mostly from the bodyguard unit that was protecting Maduro himself. So it looks as if the Venezuelans basically gave away details of President Maduro's whereabouts, isolated his security detail, and set up the situation for the Americans to capture him. And one could see the logic why the Venezuelans might do that. President Maduro himself, in many negotiations he had himself had with the Americans, apparently told the Americans that he was prepared to meet them more than halfway. He was prepared to reopen full access to Venezuela's oil industry for US companies. He was prepared to go to extraordinary lengths to satisfy all American demands with respect to Venezuela. The only point where he seems to have stood firm was on his own position. He insisted that he would not leave and would remain president of the United States. And it must have appeared to many people within the Venezuelan government that if President Maduro was prepared to concede everything, then there was really little sense in sticking by him. And it might just as well be done, therefore, to give the Americans what they wanted, to give them Maduro himself, because on every key issue, on every central point of principle, there was really nothing more to argue or fight over. And there may be here some tough-minded calculations on the part of some members of the Venezuelan government, which might not contradict fully, or might not contradict at all, their previous adherence to the policies of socialist reform carried out by Maduro himself, but mostly and far more importantly by his predecessor, Hugo Chavez. And that is that they might have said to themselves that if they can give Maduro over to the Americans and the Americans leave them alone and accept that the current government will remain in power, but if some deals between Venezuela and the United States can then be done, then something might be preserved from the Chavez reforms, the Chavez changes. It might be still possible to maintain Chavez's various social and educational and health programs. Better that than to go down fighting, have the United States basically overthrow the entire regime, and have someone like Machado come in intent on reversing everything that has been achieved. In other words, do this kind of deal. In which case, the Venezuelans were manipulating the Americans just as much as the Americans were manipulating the Venezuelans. Now, I say that, I'm not sure that this is the case, and there is something further that I think must be said, which is that it is by no means unusual in Venezuela, or rather in Latin America, and in Latin American politics, for someone who has to all intents and purposes appeared to be a die-hard loyalist for some left-wing socialist project, as soon as they are installed as president, to go over completely to the other side, to make the deal with the United States, to make the deal with the local oligarchy, if we wish to call it that, the various powerful, entrenched business and landowning interests that are to be found in every Latin American country. That way is the path to security and perhaps ultimately to riches. And one can think of various examples. So there was Lenin Moreno, who was the vice president of Ecuador's socialist leader, Rafael Correa, was supported by Rafael Correa as his successor, and who won a presidential election in Ecuador as the loyal supporter and disciple of Rafael Correa. But then who, on becoming president of Ecuador, completely reversed Correa's policies, publicly quarreled with Correa, sought to bring legal proceedings against Correa, arranged for Julian Assange to be expelled from the Ecuadorian embassy and handed over to the British, did all sorts of various other things within Ecuador itself, essentially reversing, in almost every respect, Correa's policies. And elsewhere in Latin America, we find, for example, in Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, successor to Lula da Silva, also pursuing a vaguely socialist or social democratic or at any rate left-wing program. And she then found herself in legal and other political difficulties. And her own vice president, Michael Tremor, went over, again, spectacularly to the other side. And after she'd been impeached and removed from office, also pursued policies that in effect entirely reversed Lula's entire program with which Dilma Rousseff had been connected. So there is absolutely nothing surprising, and would be nothing surprising if a vice president in Venezuela who had seemed a Chavista loyalist, after making certain statements and pronouncements that might imply that she was supportive of the Chavez-Maduro line, turns out to be intent on doing the opposite. Having said that, I'm not going to predict definitely that this is the course that Rodriguez is going to take. It seems to me that there is at least a possibility that the Venezuelan government might indeed have been manipulating the Americans in just the same way as the Americans were seeking to manipulate them, as I said earlier in the program. There are, however, a number of points that I do want to make, and briefly let me start with President Trump's extraordinary press conference. I discussed this at great length in my program yesterday, but I do want to reiterate one thing. Great powers often behave in the kind of way that the United States has behaved over Venezuela. There is nothing unusual about great powers intervening in the affairs of other countries. Certainly there is nothing unusual about the United States intervening and carrying out regime changes in countries. They do this all the time in many places around the world. They've done this many times in South America as well. There are claims circulating that this is the first time that the United States has carried out a direct military attack on a South American country. But reality is that that is merely chance. The United States has been deeply implicated in all sorts of acts of violence on the South American continent, both before and since the Second World War. And besides, it's not true to say that there has never been any overt military action taken by the United States on the South American continent. To give just one example, in 1964, at a time of the coup in Brazil, the coup that removed President Goulart and which led to Brazil coming under the control of an extremely brutal military dictatorship that ruled Brazil for over 20 years. Anyway, at that time, the United States deployed a sizable naval task force off the coast of Brazil in strong support of the coup and signaling to the internal parties within Brazil that the coup had the support of the United States. And of course, I was brought up back in the 1970s carrying out protests against the coup that had taken place in Chile, which overthrew President Allende and which led to the Pinochet dictatorship. And I remember the coup that took place in Argentina. And we now know a great deal about the kind of role that the United States played in both of those events and indeed in many others. So there is nothing remarkable or different or unusual about what the United States has done in Venezuela. And to be frank, I'm sure that there'll be many other times in the future when the United States acts in South America in the same way. What remains extraordinary is the completely unapologetic and straightforward way in which the President of the United States has justified it, or hardly even bothered to justify it. Whereas in the past, US presidents have claimed that they've acted on behalf of freedom and democracy and have acted to suppress communism, communist insurgencies, and have spoken flowery words and extraordinary language supporting whatever it is that they have authorized in South America. We have Donald Trump coming out talking straightforwardly that this is a power grab intended to seize Venezuela's oil resources and to place Venezuela economically and politically under American control. And as I said, this is different. I remember, for example, Ronald Reagan, after the 1983 US attack on Grenada, speaking to the American people, talking about the United States being the shining city on the hill, talking about the defense of liberty and freedom and all of those things. The contrast with Trump's way of doing this is remarkable. And as I said in my program yesterday, deeply unsettling, especially for America's European allies. I think people are underestimating the extent of the difference. And I'm going to say something. Empires generally, when they start behaving in a blatantly might is right, ruthless, acquisitive fashion, when they stop pretending that what they're doing serves some higher, ulterior, grander purpose, when they do that, they start to create problems for themselves. They cause unease amongst their allies. One of the most, for me, gratifying aspects of this whole affair was watching Keir Starmer struggling to explain on British television why he condemns Russian actions in Ukraine, which he says are regressive, but cannot bring himself to similarly condemn American actions in Venezuela, for example. Ultimately, allies of a great power, subordinates of a great power, always want to be given some degree of cover. They don't like to be pushed forward and appear to justify land grabs and territorial acquisitions in quite the cynical terms and brutal language that Donald Trump has used. And persistence, continuing to do this sort of thing, is going to create more frictions between the United States and at least some of its allies. And you could see that even within the United States itself, it is causing embarrassment. So that, for example, none other than Senator Tom Cotton, a neocon, if ever there was one, is now having to push back against claims made by the president himself that the United States is indeed going to run Venezuela as a semi-colony. It's not that he objects to that, it's just that he doesn't like having it straightforwardly admitted in the way that Trump has done. It is America's adversaries, the Russians, the Chinese, the Prime Minister of Slovakia, Robert Fico, who are happiest about the fact that the United States has essentially drop the mask in this episode. And words do matter, concepts do matter. It was once said that hypocrisy is the tribute vice pays to virtue. Trump has transgressed that rule, and the United States has done so as well, and eventually it will pay a price for it. That's one thing I want to say. The second is that this entire premise behind this operation, that there is a vast oil bonanza, huge mineral wealth in Venezuela that the United States is going to be able to extract, is going to prove completely and entirely wrong. I remember making exactly the same point about the enormous mineral wealth that Ukraine supposedly had. And you remember, I'm sure many of you remember, how Donald Trump, in the first weeks of his presidency, basically bullied Zelensky into signing an agreement whereby the United States would eventually get some degree of preferential treatment in the exploitation of this mineral wealth in Ukraine. And with every week, with every month that passes, we learn that there is actually less and less of it, less and less of this mineral wealth in Ukraine for the United States to exploit, and that the extent to which it even exists, and to the extent to which even rare earths are to be found in Ukraine, was much exaggerated. On that topic, by the way, I ought to say that following the capture of the town of Stepnogorsk, south of the city of Zaporozhye, in Zaporozhye region by Russia, Ukraine has lost control of one of its great manganese deposits. That was where the big big mine had been created to exploit the big, rich manganese deposit that was there. Manganese is not a rare earth, but it is a mineral which has important industrial and other applications, and it was certainly one that the United States was interested in. Well, there was never quite as much of that in Ukraine as Trump imagined, and now there is even less, because this deposit has now passed under the control of the Russians. Just saying. But anyway, if we come back to Venezuela, there's lots of stories circulating about Venezuela and its oil and the extent of its oil industry. Now, there's a very good piece about this on Naked Capitalism by the indispensable Eve Smith. But I will say I have actually been looking into this question myself over the last couple of days. And I've also been in contact with a number of people who are experts in this area, which I'm not. And, well, this is my general conclusions. Firstly, the claims that Venezuela has the world's biggest oil reserves are almost certainly wrong. In fact, they are much exaggerated. This is based on certain assumptions about the Orinoco Basin that are probably mistaken. In theory, there might be huge amounts of oil there, but much of it would be uneconomic to extract under any circumstances. And the oil itself is very heavy. It is very expensive to refine and develop. And once it has been refined, the actual quantity of it is less than some might assume. The idea that the United States will place itself in a decisive economic position because there is this enormous oil reserves that it has now laid its hands on is something which I suspect Donald Trump himself probably does believe, But like the great mineral wealth of Ukraine, I suspect it is going to be proved wrong. As one person who sent me a private email pointed out, if Venezuela did have these colossal oil reserves that we've been hearing so much about, and if these oil reserves were easy or relatively easy to develop, then it is inconceivable that the Chinese especially would not have developed them to a much greater extent than they ever did. So that's the first thing to say. For the record, just before I finish on that, I've seen one suggestion that says that Venezuela's actual usable, exploitable oil reserves are probably not the fifth, not the biggest in the world. They're probably closer to being somewhere around the fifth biggest in the world. Secondly, and it's a point that Eve Smith makes very well in her article, the Venezuelan oil industry is very run down and in very poor condition. Bringing it back to the point where it produces oil at the kind of levels that it did in the 1980s and 1990s would probably be a massive undertaking. It would require perhaps a decade of work to do, and it would require extremely heavy investment. I've seen guesstimates starting at $25 to $30 billion and going much, much higher. And, well, we are currently at a time of very low oil prices. There is currently a supply glut. The United States government is trying to strong-arm American oil companies to go to Venezuela. As Eve Smith points out, what tends to happen in these kind of situations is that the oil companies do meet with US officials. They do give the impression that they might be indeed willing to go to Venezuela and start taking steps to develop the oil industry there. But in practice, over time, the interest fades and they generally stay away. At this precise moment in time, there is little to be gained financially from massive investments in Venezuelan oil, which in the short term can only depress the oil price further and can only provide benefits in the very long term at very high cost. And, well, why would the oil companies, the big oil companies, want to do that when they already have investment programs of their own in other places, which economically speaking make much more sense? So probably the oil companies will not want to go there. And besides, and I repeat, it's a point I made myself in an earlier program, it's been suggested that the United States will want to push down the price of oil to $50 a barrel. The United States, however, is itself a major oil producer and a major oil exporter. The production of oil in the United States is a relatively expensive affair. I have read in various places that the break-even price for much of the American oil industry in terms of developing oil in the United States is $60 a barrel. That's always contentious, and there may be abilities and opportunities to push the oil price down somewhat and to gain other benefits and to have the oil industry still function. But ultimately, I cannot imagine that many oil producers in the United States would really want to see the price of oil remain indefinitely at $50 a barrel or prices around that level. It would not be good news for them or for their investors or for their creditors in the banks and other financial institutions in the United States. The only big beneficiary, if the oil price were indeed, the global oil price, were indeed depressed to those sort of levels, would be the world's biggest manufacturer, which is, of course, China, which is the rival and adversary of the United States. So I don't think this is ever going to happen, but it doesn't make very much geostrategic sense for the United States to do it. It would undermine its own oil industry, benefit China disproportionately. Of course, American consumers would benefit from lower energy prices, but given the industrial realities in the United States, in the long term, whatever the short-term electoral benefits for Donald Trump, were that unlikely eventuality to happen, in the long term, American consumers buying more because they had more money in their pockets because of low energy costs would almost certainly translate into a bigger Chinese trade surplus. Just saying. So, again, a lot of the assumptions here that the United States is making are probably wrong. Venezuela is said to be rich in many other minerals as well, and I've no doubt that that is true. There's also claims that there are rare earths in Venezuela too, and no doubt that would be attractive for the Americans as well. Again, people need to be cautious. The same has been said about Ukraine. The same was previously said about Afghanistan also. By the way, I do wonder whether in practice, the mineral wealth of Venezuela is indeed going to be as easy to develop and exploit as some people assume. And anyway, the time needed to develop mineral extracting and refining industries in Venezuela, well, it is a project of at least 10 years, probably longer, long after Donald Trump himself will have left the political scene, and long after the geopolitical situation in the world will have changed still further. So President Trump talks about this being basically about oil, but I don't think it is going to have quite the effects that he believes it will. Certainly, if he thinks that ramping up sanctions and pressure on the Russian oil industry is going to be easier to do because there's going to be a sudden big glut of Venezuelan oil on the market, I predict that he's going to find that he is wrong. He is already again making noises about imposing more tariffs on India, which, as I have pointed out, continues to buy Russian oil. And in fact, Reliance, the Indian oil refiner, is absolutely, as it turns out, still involved in that trade. The Indians and the Chinese will continue to buy oil from Russia because after what has happened in Venezuela, after the brutal language that Trump has used, explaining his reasons for intervening in Venezuela as he has done, explaining straightforwardly that it is all some big asset grab, the Chinese and the Indians are not going to want to become dependent on a president and a country that not only behaves but talks like that when it comes to the import of an essential commodity like oil. So, as I said, this entire premise behind this operation is going to be proved wrong, and that, of course, doesn't even address the other big question, which is the question of political stability in Venezuela, the extent to which Rodriguez really does want to cooperate with the United States and to open up Venezuela and to bring it basically under American control, the potential for resistance and opposition from Venezuelan society to all of these things. This imperialistic neo-colonial language that Trump and some people in his administration are now resorting to is justifications that belong to another era, to the era of the 19th century. And by the way, even then, they turned out to be mostly wrong. I'll give a quick example. One of the reasons, widely known, that one of the reasons for the Boer War, the war that the British fought against the Afrikaners in South Africa, was because the British wanted to gain a tight control of the gold supply from South Africa, because they didn't want South Africa's gold to fall under the control of the Germans, Britain's then imperial rival, at a time when currencies were all linked to gold. Well, the British won that war and gained control of the gold in South Africa. That was at the beginning of the 20th century. 30 years later, Britain had to take sterling off the gold standard during the 1931 financial crisis. It has never been on the gold standard at any point since. And, well, 10 years after that, 10, 15 years after that, the entire British Empire itself collapsed. These commodity grabs are a massive distraction and a huge mistake. The power of countries is achieved through the internal development of their own societies and economies. There is a huge amount for the United States to do, and which the United States could profitably do within its own country, mucking around in Venezuela, sending American troops and special forces there, abducting presidents, overthrowing governments, upsetting its own allies, alarming much of the world, absolutely is not a substitute for doing any one of those things. And of course, all it's going to do in the end is distract the United States and bog it down in the problems of another country when it should be focused instead on the problems back home. So anyway, that's one other thing I wanted to say. And there is one very last thing, which is that I've discussed the various predatory operations that the United States conducts in South America. I would say this: whenever things like this take place, whenever the Americans do an operation like the one they've just done in Venezuela, the cry always goes up: where are the Russians? Where are the Chinese? Why aren't they resisting it? Despite the fact that a glance at the map shows how difficult it is, or indeed how impossible realistically it would be, either for Russia or China at this point in time, to do very much to prevent what took place in Venezuela over the weekend. It always amazes me that nobody asks the question of Brazil, which, as I've discussed in recent programs on this channel, is the country that ought to be the regional great power. Brazil is a huge country. It has an enormous population, a big population, and enormous resources. It ought to be the country that is able to push back against the United States over direct interference in its own region. Brazil has made statements criticizing what the United States has done. It signed statements with 5 other countries, one of which, interestingly, was Spain, criticizing the step that the United States has made. But anybody who looks at Brazil's size would have to agree that it has completely failed to assert itself in this particular crisis. And it goes beyond the personal animus which existed between Lula and Maduro to explain this. The simple fact is that Brazil itself shares many of the same pathologies and weaknesses that other Latin American states also have, and which make it very difficult for the region itself to resist these predatory actions that the Americans take. And I have to say this, Brazil is a country with which I've always taken a great interest and have an axiomatic fondness. It appears to me a warm, passionate, friendly country. But in some respects, it consistently disappoints. I remember in the 1990s, reading in the Financial Times, how its economy at that time was much bigger than Russia's. This is the time shortly after the Soviet collapse. In fact, I remember reading that its economy at that time was twice the size of Russia's. And this was in the 1990s. There were many predictions that Brazil would be the country that would move forward and which would be one of the major powers of the future. Well, how have things turned out? By 2014, late 2014, a friend of mine who was interested in these economic matters was telling me that Brazil and Russia had economies that were roughly the same size. I didn't believe it then, by the way, but that was what he said. And he was, by the way, talking on purchasing power parity basis, and he had much more knowledge of the Brazilian economy than I did. Well, today, if you go to the figures for purchasing power for GDP based on purchasing power parity, Russia's economy stands at over $7 trillion, with the caveat given by the World Bank, and especially that it's probably much larger than this, because up to 40% of the Russian economy is not being tracked by statistics and World Bank estimates, in which case the true size of the Russian economy is probably around $10 trillion. The Brazilian economy currently has a GDP by purchasing power on a purchasing power parity basis of $4.9 trillion. It might be half the size of Russia's. On every other metric, it seems to me that Brazil also falls behind. Brazil, as we know, doesn't control many of its cities. They're racked with violent crime. There are plenty of places in Brazil where there are no-go areas for the security forces and where the writ of the government doesn't run. The Brazilian government doesn't even control its own prison system. You absolutely cannot say that about Russia. Brazil does have a strong aircraft industry, Embraer, but it is completely overshadowed by the one that Russia has built up or rebuilt over the last 25 years. Consider that the Russians are now building big high bypass turbofans. The Brazilians have to import all of their turbofans, all of their aircraft engines from the United States. You can make the same comparisons in industry after industry, sector after sector. I firmly believe that someday Brazil and the rest of Latin America will find its way. But until and unless they do, until they sort out their problems, the major structural problems which exist within their own societies, they will always be at risk of this kind of predatory action by the United States. And it is unreasonable to blame outsiders, distant, remote outsiders, like the Chinese and the Russians, for the fact that this sort of thing happens. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this affair, this Venezuelan affair. I intend to cease discussing it, at least for a while, unless there's any major developments over the next few days or weeks. I now intend to revert to more, shall we say, traditional topics, which is the conflict in Ukraine. Now, Zelensky has continued to work on this extremely elaborate and complicated power rearrangement that is taking place in Kiev. I touched on it in previous programs. All I will say about it is that it is not going to change the immediate situation in Ukraine. Budanov is clearly the rising man. He's now chief of staff. I've explained why I think that is important for the long term. It does suggest that military acts, that as soon as the conventional war ends, an insurgency war probably is coming. But it does seem as if Zelensky still has some cards to play. Instead of the person that I'd expected to take over Ukrainian military intelligence, Yermak's old fiefdom, Zelensky is appointing to take over that post the head of Ukraine's foreign intelligence service, who is an ally, or was an ally, of Zelensky's former number two and close political ally, the man who was recently ousted, Andrei Yermak. So, anyway, we can spend a huge amount of time discussing the situation in Kiev, but as I said, I don't believe it is going to make any fundamental or important difference, at least not in terms of negotiations, not in terms of the day-to-day conduct of the war. Its importance is going to become clearer later when the war ends with, as I predict, a Russian military victory. In the meantime, however, Zelensky and his officials are again talking about the need for more weapons and, of course, more money from the West. As far as I can judge, on the basis of the very limited reports that have been circulating, the meeting of national security advisors from Europe and Ukraine, which took place, I believe, in Kiev on the 3rd of January, was mostly about getting more money, Ukraine getting more money and more weapons from the West. It doesn't seem as if money is going to come from the United States. Trump, again, seems to be ruling that out. So, as night follows day, the Ukrainians are going to come to the Europeans, and especially to the Germans, and are going to go on asking for more and more. As I've also explained in many programs, the 90 billion euro loan that was promised to Ukraine last month has not yet crystallized, and it may take many weeks and months before that money appears. And if it ever does, in fact, appear, and if it does appear, it won't be anywhere close to being enough and will probably start to run out sometime in the summer. So the bottomless pit, which is Ukraine, the bottomless pit into which the European leadership continues to throw into European taxpayers' money, remains, and its demands continue, and they continue exactly as before. At some point in the next few weeks and months, as the problems, financial problems in Ukraine start to grow, the cry for more money from Europe is going to reach deafening proportions, and we'll see whether at that point they either come up with more money, or they revisit the issue of trying to steal, seize, confiscate, call it what you like, the Russian reserves or something like that. More interesting in some ways is the extraordinary complex game that continues to be conducted between the United States and Russia. Putin and Trump had their telephone call, their two telephone calls last month. And of course, Trump in between met with Zelensky. Over the course of the second call, Putin informed Trump that the Ukrainians had carried out a drone attack on his Valdai residence in Novgorod. None of the drones got through, but according to the Russians, over the course of the call, Trump denied all knowledge, obviously, said that this was outrageous and wrong, said that he was deeply shocked, and that he was appalled that such a thing could possibly have happened. And then, almost simultaneously, we began to get reports in the US media that Ukrainian drone attacks on Russian territory were largely effected with the assistance and targeting and guidance of the CIA. And we got further reports that the CIA director, Mr. Radcliffe, had assured Trump that the drones that the Russians were complaining about were targeting some military facility in Novgorod, not Putin's own residence. And, well, since then, there's been virtual radio silence from Putin himself. On the 1st of January, his website reported that he received a report from the Russian authorities about the Ukrainian attack on a hotel in Kherson region, Russian-controlled Kherson region, which killed, I now believe the figure is 29 civilians. And then there was silence, which lasted for several days. Today, the Kremlin is reporting that Putin has congratulated the Russian Paralympic team on its reintegration into the Paralympic movement. It looks to me, I have to say, like the kind of statement that Putin regularly sends off. I suspect it was drafted by others, and I doubt that he personally was involved in preparing it. So Putin is lying very low at the moment. I mean, he's been invisible, entirely invisible, over the last several days. Now, there may be various entirely innocuous explanations for this. It could be that he's resting. Russia celebrates Christmas on the 7th of January. This is the Christmas holiday. Putin had an intense December. He visited India at the beginning. He carried out a massive Q&A. He met with the military on 2 occasions. He had 2 very long discussions with the Russian government on economic matters. He met with Russian businessmen. He also had lots of contacts with foreign leaders. It would be unsurprising if after such an intense schedule, Putin gave himself some days of rest. And it may be that there's nothing in this further than that. Or it could be that he's ill. I don't mean seriously ill, because all of the indications are that Putin is actually in good health, despite claims to the contrary that you sometimes read in the British media. But it might be that he's caught a cold or flu. Of course, this is the time of year for that, and he's taking time off to recover. Could be something like that. But I do wonder, given that, as I said, the appearances with Putin basically broke off after he gave his New Year address and received a report about the attack on Kherson region, I do wonder whether the Kremlin isn't in the process of undertaking some very deep and complex and important discussions about the way forward, both in Ukraine and with Donald Trump. Because I have to say that the more I thought about the various denials from the United States about the drone attack on his residence, the more bizarre and strange they seem to me. First of all, the United States itself accepts that it has admitted publicly through the media, through the New York Times, that it has a high degree of control over Ukraine's drone offensive against Russia. Just saying. Secondly, the Americans are saying, Donald Trump himself now said, that the attack, the drone attack on Novgorod, was not on Putin's residence, but on some other military facility in Novgorod. Well, I've been waiting for them to say which military facility, but they haven't said so. They haven't disclosed which military facility the Ukrainians are supposed to have been targeting. Why not? The Russians know that facility is there. The Ukrainians know that facility is there. The Americans know that the facility is there. When there is an attack on a particular location and it appears that there's been some confusion and there's a mistake that some other target might have been threatened, the usual thing is to come out and say, no, the attack wasn't on Putin's residence, it was on this airbase, training center, arms factory, whatever it was that the Ukrainians were supposed to be attacking. Nothing like that has appeared. No word to that effect has been said, which, as I said, does seem to me very surprising. So here we have the Americans admitting that they control the drones, or at least many of the drones, admitting that there was a drone attack on Novgorod. Bear in mind that in the initial hours after the attack, the Western media, the British media especially, were pretending or claiming or giving the impression that there'd be no attack on Novgorod of any kind, that the whole thing was a fairy tale conjured up by the Russians, or even perhaps a Russian false flag. But now the Americans admit that there was actually an attack on Novgorod, on a military facility close to Putin's residence. Well, what is going on? Maybe the Americans are covering from the Ukrainians. Maybe they know that the attack was indeed on Putin's residence, but they don't want to embarrass Zelensky or the Ukrainians, and they're telling the Ukrainians, don't do this again. Maybe that's one explanation. Maybe the Americans are trying to keep the negotiation track going, so they're saying publicly, yes, there was an attack, contradicting what the Ukrainians and the Europeans are saying, but no, it wasn't an attack on Putin's residence, as the Russians are saying, in order to keep both sides happy, or at least feeling that they're being listened to by the Americans as a way to facilitate negotiations, the future negotiations. Well, of course, there is another theory which has been circulating, and it's been circulating very widely on the Russian internet. I was skeptical about it before, but I am now starting to have my own doubts about this. Anyway, that in fact this was an assassination attempt on Putin, and that the United States, or some agencies in the United States, played some sort of role in it. I want to stress, it's pure speculation. I don't know whether or not it is true. Now, whether it is true or not, though, the question is, what do the Russians themselves think? The Russians read the New York Times. They know that the Americans are openly bragging about the fact that they're assisting the Ukrainians to conduct drone attacks inside Russia. The Russians, of course, have long known that the Ukrainians conduct drone attacks inside Russia with the assistance of the Americans. The Russians know that there was this attack on Novgorod. They gave the Americans, as they would say, a good opportunity to dissociate themselves entirely from this attack. The Americans now, after initially appearing to do so, are now doing so no longer. In fact, Trump has reverted to his previous surly self. He's again talking about how disappointed he is with Putin. Well, as I said, what I believe on any matter like this is unimportant. It's what the Russians believe that might be more important. And I wonder whether some people in Moscow might be having some discussions with Putin about this episode and might be saying to him, Mr. Putin, Mr. President, look, you've gone through this long process of trying to negotiate with the Americans, trying to come to some kind of diplomatic understanding with them. And all that's happening is that the Ukrainians are trying to assassinate you. Zelensky himself gave a Christmas Day address in which he all but said as much. And clearly, at some level at least, the Americans are involved. How can you continue further with this charade? Well, I would not be surprised if this discussion is indeed underway in Moscow. I think that Putin, despite everything, despite whatever warnings and advice he might be receiving, probably will still want to continue with a negotiating track in which he is personally heavily invested, and as he has said himself, he needs to do this because his allies in the global south want him to do this, and insist upon it. And I suspect that that imperative continues very much as before. So, probably, despite everything, Putin will continue with the negotiations. But I wonder whether, over the last couple of days, they become even more contentious than they have been previously. Now, in saying this, I should just add two things. The informant who passes on to me from time to time information that is published in the discussion spaces of the Duma in Moscow, the Russian parliament. Anyway, he has told me that in Russia, within the political leadership and certainly within the military, the whole negotiations is seen as purely a charade. Nobody really takes them seriously. Nobody expects that they're going to lead to any sort of outcome. The operative assumption amongst most Russian decision makers is that the United States is still very much in the conflict in Ukraine and is not going to pull out. And they don't take the negotiation there very seriously. They have to go through the motions because this is what their allies, China, India, Brazil, and all of the others, continue to insist on. And Russia doesn't want to put in jeopardy the entire process of BRICS construction and its own trade and relations with these countries by ignoring what they say. So there is that. I have to say also that it does seem to me that there is probably another factor at play too, which is that persisting with the negotiations does have one other advantage, one positive advantage from a Russian point of view. And that is that it does cause at least public dissension within the Western alliance. The Europeans, worried about the fact that the Americans are talking to the Russians and are excluding them. Constant subtext of criticisms of the Americans by the Europeans, increasing levels of anxiety in Europe, doubts about the long-term stability of the American-US relationship, of the American-European relationship, further heightened now by what has happened in Venezuela. Better leave that to fester and continue by continuing with the negotiations, rather than simply reject negotiations outright, say that you need to simply accept the terms that Russia set out in on the 14th of June 2024 over the course of Putin's speech to the Russian Foreign Ministry, and leave it at that, because in that case there would be no scope for dissension within the West, and Russia might find itself up against, in effect, a united West. So I could see some of the logic in these negotiations, in continuing with these negotiations. But it has become increasingly apparent to me, and this is where I return to my point about many Russians seeing these negotiations as a charade, that apart from Putin himself, no other senior Russian official, not Lavrov, not Medvedev, not Mishustin, the prime minister, who avoids talking about these things, not Belousov, not Shoigu, no other major Russian official seems to be at all keen on these negotiations or to be placing any significant hopes in them. The person, the one important political figure in Russia who advocates for them is Putin himself. No one, to any extent other than him, does. Just say, if the drone attack on Valdai really was an assassination attempt on Putin, and I have difficulty seeing what else it was intended to be, then all I would say is that, again, just as somebody maybe making major misjudgments about the size of Venezuela's oil reserves and the extent to which these can be exploited by the United States, someone is also making major mistake about the political situation in Moscow. If Putin is assassinated, not only will there be an enormous Russian response, but almost certainly, in fact definitely, whoever takes over from him will be a much more hardline, much more intransigent figure than Putin himself. Just saying. Anyway, let's turn now to the situation in the war. The last few hours have seen another massive drone attack by Ukraine against Russia, and another far more powerful Russian drone attack against Ukraine. And in fact, there is lots of speculation and lots of discussion that the Russians are working up to another massive, gigantic strike with vast numbers of Geran drones and hypersonic missiles and other types of missiles at some point over the next few days. And the Gerans continue, by the way, to become ever more sophisticated. Now they're carrying air-to-air missiles. There's pictures showing them doing so. To be precise, they're not air-to-air missiles. They are manpads, adapted surface-to-air missiles of the sort that are carried by soldiers. They're now being put on some of the Geran drones, where they can start hunting Ukrainian drone interceptors. Some of these are drones, others are helicopters, others are aircraft. The Russian drones now have the means to defend themselves. Now, on these various drone attacks, I think there's something perhaps which the United States might care to ask itself. Because now that we know how heavily involved the United States is in Ukrainian drone attacks on Russia, perhaps the time has come for someone in Washington to point out to the CIA that not only is what they're doing extremely dangerous, but it has been a shocking waste of resources and money. Because the drone attacks, the Ukrainian drone attacks on Russia are achieving nothing, whereas the Russian drone and missile attacks on Ukraine continue to get more and more devastating. Once again, we see the United States applauding itself for doing something that is expensive and ineffective and ultimately counterproductive. But what about the actual situation on the front lines? Well, there's been quite a lot of things taking place over the last couple of days. The Russian advances in Zaporozhye region continue, and the Russians continue to press westwards from Gulyapolye and eastwards from Stepnogorsk, and it's not difficult to see that a pincer movement is now underway, and the expectations in Russia are that the town of Orekhov itself, where the Russians claim that they are already fighting, will fall under Russian control, perhaps in March, as soon as March, leaving the way for Zaporozhye city itself open. Now, I said in my previous program that there's a lot of reports about a major Russian offensive northwest of Pakrovsk, and indeed there's been lots of footage and more reports about this, but not perhaps quite as detailed as I'd expected. What does seem to have happened instead is some kind of Ukrainian raid back into Rodinska, and the Ukrainians have produced footage of their soldiers in Rodinska raising Ukrainian flags. It is again the usual operation that the Ukrainians carry out. The very fact that they're raising flags is a sign that they don't expect that to stay there for very long, that this is intended instead to push back against Russian claims that they control Rodinska. If there was a battle, a real battle underway in Rodinska, and if the Ukrainians really were intending to recapture Rodinska, then these Ukrainian soldiers would not be pulling up the Ukrainian flag in the first days of the operation. They would be waiting until the operation itself was completed and Rodinska had passed fully under Ukrainian control before they did that. Everything about this operation, this latest operation, suggests to me that it is another one of these pieces of theatre the Ukrainians are addicted to, sending small groups of men into a captured city, captured by the Russians that is, raising a Ukrainian flag and then leaving. They tried to do the same apparently in Pakrovsk, but there it appears they have been unsuccessful. Just saying. Elsewhere, there continue to be reports that the Russians are pressing westwards from Siversk, and the Ukrainians have now admitted that the Russians have effectively cut all supplies to the Ukrainian garrison in Liman. Liman is now under immense pressure. The Russians, according to their claims, are already inside Liman in the north and south of this town. There is little doubt, however, that Russian drones connect the supply roads to Liman. These accounts about the crisis in supplies for the Ukrainian garrison come from the Ukrainians themselves. I suspect that Liman is indeed very soon going to fall. And interestingly, there were some more reports from the Kupiansk area, and these point to the Russians actually coming very close now to ending the cauldron, to liquidating the cauldron of the Ukrainian forces on the east bank of the Oskol River, the area where, according to Gerasimov, a few days ago, 2,500 Ukrainian troops continue to be trapped, because the Russian Defense Ministry yesterday announced the capture in this very same area of a village called Pilodi, and apparently drone footage, video footage has appeared of Russian soldiers, both in this village and of all sorts of other places nearby. And it looks about as if this cauldron is indeed close, finally, to its final collapse. If the Russians have indeed, or do indeed, clear this cauldron soon, then that will, of course, release the Russian troops to do whatever it is that they still need to do west of Kupiansk or in Kupiansk itself, where the Ukrainians still claim that they're counterattacking and where the Russians still claim that they're repelling the Ukrainian counterattacks. Now, this is midwinter. We are still in the period of the public holidays in Russia. As I said, this is the period in Russia between the New Year and Christmas holidays. Russia, to repeat, celebrates Christmas on the 7th of January. And the weather conditions have been difficult. Also, the Russians have been very, very busy on the Ukrainian battlefronts over the last few months. They've captured Siversk, Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, Gulyapolye. They're fighting north of Pokrovsk. They've captured Rodinska. Despite the Ukrainian counterattack that has happened there, they will soon undoubtedly consolidate control over Rodinska. As I said, they've been very busy over the last few months. It is unsurprising if, especially in light of the difficult weather conditions, the Russians have stopped for a few days to refit and consolidate and replace tired troops with fresh troops and to prepare for the next offensive. I suspect that we will probably get reports that this cauldron east of Kupiansk is indeed going to fall at some point within the next couple of days. And quite plausibly, we will learn about the fall of Liman fairly soon. The next place, I suspect, will be Konstantinovka. That, I suspect, is where the fighting over the winter is going to be most intense. And of course, the fall of Konstantinovka will finally be the end of the Ukrainian defense lines in Donbass. At that point, only the two isolated cities of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk will be left, and the Russians will be in complete control of all the main railway lines and all of the roads. Thereafter, probably in the summer, or spring, we're going to see operations against Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, and probably in the spring and summer, an advance towards Zaporozhye city once Orekhov the battle for Orekhov is over. In the meantime, if I am right in my speculations, and they are only speculations, I do want to stress this, if I am right in my speculations, then there is probably a debate underway in Moscow about the negotiations and about the future and the future course of the war. I doubt myself that Putin is going to completely end contacts with the Trump administration, even if he is convinced that there was an assassination attempt on him and that the Americans did have a role in it. But I do expect that the Russian stance will harden. Ushakov has already seen that the Russians are preparing to revisit their terms and to set out stronger conditions. And of course, the Ukrainian army continues to weaken. The Russian army continues to grow stronger. The Oreshniks are now available and might soon be in play. 2026 is going to be a devastating year for Ukraine, and I suspect a crisis year for Europe too. And of course, if a collapse happens in Ukraine, then whatever ephemeral triumphs Trump might imagine he has achieved in Venezuela are going to quickly fade into the twilight. Back in 1965, the US President, Lyndon Johnson, carried out a very successful military operation against a small Latin American country, the Dominican Republic. It's a completely forgotten episode today. The United States invaded the Dominican Republic on flimsy pretexts, overthrew its government, brought the Dominican Republic firmly into the US orbit, and essentially assumed control. For a short time, this operation did perhaps cause some kind of an upward bump in Lyndon Johnson's authority, the US President Lyndon Johnson's authority. The hawks, as they were called then, neocons as they would be called now, were very happy, no doubt, with what he managed in the Dominican Republic. But of course, the real crisis was not the Dominican Republic any more than today it is Venezuela. The real crisis in the 1960s was Vietnam, where already the seeds of defeat were laid when the Americans carried out their operation against the Dominican Republic. And just as today, very few people remember this operation that the Americans conducted in the 1960s against the Dominican Republic. But virtually everybody knows about Vietnam. So I predict in a few years' time, the Maduro kidnap will be remembered as little more than a punctuation mark. The great event of these times also is the conflict in Ukraine, especially if, as I have no doubt will eventually happen, it also ends in a Western defeat. Anyway, this is where I finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X, and also our new Substack site. Please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button, to check Patreon and Subscribe Star and our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.